Today we are visiting the place of the skull and the garden tomb. The journey to the cross began when Jesus set his face like a flint to Jerusalem. You are looking at a large-scale model of Jerusalem located at the Shrine of the Book Museum. It features Herod's temple just as it must have looked in Jesus' day. It was a massive building. After the triumphal entry and the cleansing of the temple, Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples in Jerusalem, somewhere in the upper city. Then he went to the Mount of Olives and to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. That is where Jesus was arrested. After his arrest, he was tried in a number of clandestine courts. The first was at Caiaphas' palace. Then it was off to Pilate's at the fortress of Antonia. Pilate sent Jesus back across the city to Herod, but he was finally condemned by Pilate, likely at the Antonia fortress. Then Jesus walked the Via Dolorosa, meaning the way of suffering. Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem that day, the soldiers tried to clear the narrow streets, but the crowd pressed in to see a man condemned to die on Calvary. He was bleeding from a beating, there were stripes upon his back, and he wore a crown of thorns upon his head, and he bore with every step the scorn of those who cried out for his death. Down the Via Dolorosa, called the way of suffering, like a lamb came the Messiah, Christ the King. But he chose to walk that road out of his love for you and me. Down the Via Dolorosa, all the way to Calvary. While there are two possible sites for Jesus' crucifixion and burial, we have chosen the place of the skull and the garden tomb because it seems to best fit the evidence. We will take you to Gordon's Calvary. Jesus was crucified just outside the city walls on one of the busiest roads leading to Jerusalem. On our way to Golgotha, the place of the skull, we will walk the Via Dolorosa. There are 14 stations of the cross on the Via Dolorosa. At each station, tradition has it that something significant happened to Jesus, like Station 1, where his beating occurred. During Holy Week, the narrow streets are crowded with pilgrims. Some streets are so narrow you can't even get a car down them. When touring the place of the garden tomb, we are not necessarily following the path Jesus took. Instead, we will walk through the garden to the place of the skull. They would have taken the road through the Damascus Gate. From here, you might walk down by the ancient wine press in Joseph of Arimathea's garden. Then we will make our way to the garden tomb. This is the path to Skull Hill. Joseph of Arimathea might have walked this very path the day Jesus died. It was not the ideal place for a garden or burial plot, overlooking a place of public execution, but that is where he had his family burial plot. From here, we can look to the west and see the city walls. Hundreds of people traveling for Passover would have walked right past this very location through the Damascus Gate. Hebrews 13:2 says that Jesus suffered just outside the city gate. And here is the place of the skull, Golgotha. Amazingly, you can make out the eyes and the nose of the skull, but time has weathered these rocks, and construction has changed the way things look. But an old picture taken in 1936 clearly shows the skull. The name Golgotha means skull. In 1 Samuel 15:4, David brought Goliath's skull to Jerusalem and buried it there. The term Golgotha, we're told, is a corruption of the Hebrew words Goliath, Gath, or Golgotha. Some speculate that Goliath was buried right below the place where Jesus was crucified. It seemed like a good place to bury his skull. If so, this is a beautiful connection, since Jesus crushed the giant sin problem by his death. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross. Jesus was crucified on that hill, or so we're told. We do know that Jesus was crucified on Mount Moriah, the same hill that Abraham offered Isaac on. It was here that God provided a lamb. When we think of the crucifixion, most of us do think that Jesus was crucified on top of that hill, Skull Hill. That's what most movies show. But as our tour guide pointed out, Romans like to crucify criminals down by the side of the busiest road, next to the busiest entrance to the city, so that everyone entering the city would see him. The Gospels do say in Matthew 27:29 that the passers-by hurled insults at him and said, "If you are the Son of God, save yourself." The very use of the term passers-by indicates that they were passing by on a main road. From the place of the skull, we will head to the wine press of the garden. While this is a beautiful garden today, back in Jesus' time it was a working garden. There would have been grapevines. Once again, while describing historical events, the scriptures are unerringly true. In fact, in recent times, archaeologists have found a huge water system underneath the garden that Joseph would have used to haul up water for his grapes. And here is where he would press them. And now we come to the garden tomb. Here is a view from the side. And this is the trough that was used for rolling the stone. The tomb itself had a preparation chamber in which the body would be washed and wrapped with spices, according to Jewish tradition. It also served as the weeping room. In the far corner is where Jesus would have been laid. After burial, the Jews let the body decay for a year and then would put the bones into an ossuary box. Jesus never made it to that box. On the near side of the tomb is an unfinished burial place, presumably for Joseph's wife. In the center is where the angel would have sat. If you walk into the tomb and look where Jesus was laying, you would say that the angel was on the right side of the body, just as Mark 16:5 says. To get into the tomb, you have to duck. Luke 24:12 says that Peter had to bend down to enter the tomb. The garden tomb entrance is only about 4.5 feet high. Here is the place where Jesus was laid. It's a funeral place, hewn out of solid rock. I don't know if you can tell, but the other side has a place for another body, but the head and feet were never completely finished. John 19:41 says that Jesus was put in a tomb in which no one had ever been laid. The fact that one side was never completed suggests that once Jesus died, this tomb was considered much too sacred for a burial place. Even though it was intended for Joseph's tomb, he never used it. No human remains have ever been found in the garden tomb. Instead, the testimony of the place of the skull and the empty garden tomb are not only that God's word is true, but that Christ is risen just as the scriptures say. And with the disciples we cry, "He is risen. He is risen indeed. And because he is risen, I will rise."